And that's the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the regulation. And in Formula One, there's almost no spirit.
You lot think Gunter Steiner is a mad team boss.
Now we are a fucking bunch of wankers.
But this guy is on another level entirely. Of all the people in Formula 1 we could talk about, Flavio Briatore's story is filled with controversy. He was good at winning, but was always on the edge of being thrown out of the sport. Until he was.
Flavio Briatore has been banned from all motorsport.
Flavio Briatore is now a man banned from F1 for life. But he was part of winning 7 world titles in total, and one of the most charismatic characters in F1 history.
Because I was one of the best.
This is his story of dealings with the Mafia, financial fraud, plenty of cheating, and international disgrace. A young Briatore born in rural Italy in 1950 didn't inspire hope for his infamous future. He dropped out of multiple public schools before enrolling in a private school. He didn't fare much better there, receiving the lowest grade in his year. After school, Flavio opened a restaurant bearing his nickname Tribola, which translated means someone who would do anything to get what they want, which was a nod to his future. However, this business was quickly shut down after debt piled high. I guess the lenders didn't exactly agree with the name, but this is where our story takes a much more notorious turn. By the early 1970s, Briatore had become the assistant for Mafia-associated Attilio Dutto, owner of the Paramati Vinici paint company. After Dutto was killed in a car bomb attack in 1979, Briatore moved to Milan to work at the Italian Stock Exchange. Here he would meet a man that would change the course of his life. Luciano Bennetton, the owner of the famous clothing brand known for its brightly coloured clothing. But before Bennetton could change his life, Flavio nearly ruined his own. During the 1980s, Briatore had multiple run-ins with the law, resulting in him being sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for 2 separate counts of fraud. After his old boss Dutto died, his company collapsed into bankruptcy and liquidation under suspicious circumstances. Briatore was caught up in the criminal investigation, and in 1984 he was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. Now, of course, Briatore didn't want to serve any time in prison, and so he fled to the Virgin Islands, where he stayed in touch with his friend Luciano Bennetton and set up multiple stores on the island for the fashion house. In 1986, the fugitive Briatore was sentenced by a court in Milan to a further 3 years in prison for his role in another fraudulent scheme, tricking rich individuals through illegal casino halls in the early 1980s. They essentially ran illegal gambling games where Briatore and his mates would set up one player. It was completely rigged, and they walked away with billions of lira, which is around $1.4 million today. But Briatore wouldn't serve any prison time and would only return to Italy once his sentence was cancelled by amnesty. And Briatore's success on the Virgin Islands didn't go unnoticed by his friend Luciano, and when Bennetton expanded into the US market, he appointed Briatore to run the operation. The clothes brand expanded massively, having over 800 stores in the US alone, and Briatore took a cut of all of them, making him a very rich man. But soon he was getting itchy to try a new challenge, and once again his friend Bennetton had an opportunity for him, but this time it had nothing to do with clothes. Bennetton, the fashion brand, had bought the Toleman F1 team in 1986, a team made famous by Senna's incredible drive to position 2 at Monaco 2 years earlier. Bennetton then rebranded the team under his own name, but it continued to be a midfielder, so Bennetton took a risk on a guy that would do anything to win, Flavio Briatore. And after attending the 1988 Australian Grand Prix, Flavio Briatore was appointed commercial director of Benetton Formula 1 and was quickly promoted to managing director in 1990. All this in despite of him admitting that he knew very little about F1 and didn't even find the sport that interesting. But what he lacked in knowledge, he more than made up for by surrounding himself with people who did.
I'm William Toet. I worked with Flavio Briatore at the Benetton team. I joined the team in 85 before he joined. I worked there from 85 until 95. So I think Flavio Briatore's management style was quite hands-off with people lower down, and dealt with fairly quickly the people at higher levels, and say, as a boss, looking at the way he behaved compared to those I've seen afterwards, relatively hands-off. He arrived without massive motorsport knowledge, so he was wise to not try to interfere. He left the technical people to do the technical work.
And this was one of Briatore's great strengths, knowing where talent was and grabbing it. He quickly got rid of Tollman's management and established his own. In 1991, he appointed Tom Walkinshaw as engineering director and the now famous Ross Brawn as technical director. As we know, Brawn is now managing director of motorsport for the whole of F1. And Tom Walkinshaw was one of the best team managers and engineering minds in F1 at the time. But potentially their best hire was a young Michael Schumacher, who had stunned the F1 world with his blistering pace at the 1991 Belgian Grand Prix. After Schumi's stellar start in F1, Briatore acted decisively, and Schumacher was in a Benetton before the next race in Italy.
One of the really positive things that Flavio was able to do was spot an opportunity. He didn't always get it right, but spot an opportunity to take on good people. So Michael Schumacher is the perfect example. He'd already effectively been signed by another team, and he just went in and thought, this guy is head and shoulders ahead. And he just went in heavy and got him immediately.
The Benetton team now had all the tools in place to rise to the top of F1. But with Briatore, controversy was never too far away. The team went from strength to strength over the next 2 years, with Schumacher especially showing his quality on track. But it was 1994 when the challenge and controversy really ramped up. Schumacher won the 94 Drivers' Championship in a controversial fashion when he collided with Damon Hill in the last race. Both drivers were close on points, and neither driver was able to finish this final race, and so Schumacher became champion at the side of the track. However, that wasn't the only question mark over their title win that year. They were actually accused of cheating multiple times. So refueling during the race was actually introduced in 1994 to help spice up the show. At the first race of the season in Brazil, Schumacher was fighting with Ayrton Senna for the race win when they were approaching their pit stop. Senna pitted first, but when Schumacher pitted a lap later, he easily jumped the Brazilian. In fact, a little bit too easily. Schumacher would go on to win that race, and this raised suspicion that Benetton had been meddling with their fuel hose to gain an advantage. The fuel hoses at this time were regulated to a certain speed. However, the FIA didn't have precise timing technology that we have today, so it is very hard to say for sure. But these suspicions were seemingly confirmed at the German Grand Prix later that year, after Jos Verstappen's scary fire in the pits during the race. Yep, that's Max's dad. Verstappen's Benetton caught fire when petrol sprayed out of the hose as they attempted refueling, creating a fireball that would engulf the car, driver and mechanics. The FIA investigated the incident and found that Benetton had removed the fuel filter from the rig, which was rumoured to speed up refueling by about 12.5%, saving about 1 second per pit stop. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Briatore had far more shifty stuff in the works. Flavio Briatore had bought the struggling Ligier team at the beginning of the 1994 season, supposedly to acquire its stockpile of Renault engines to then put in the Benetton cars. The Renaults were the best engines of the time and had powered Williams to the previous 2 titles. But as always, Briatore had spotted another and sneakier benefit that would come with the Ligier team. Benetton would share technical data to help Ligier, who were a backmarker at the time, and help them move up the grid to take points from Benetton's rivals.
It culminated in Ligier people in Ligier uniform coming to Benetton, the Benetton team at Enstone, and making parts from Benetton molds for their cars. I mean, wow. It's a very hefty fine when you get caught. Yeah. And so that really pissed off the people at Benetton, because everyone knew that was not kosher. You shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Benetton would then use Ligier to ask questions about regulations to the FIA without anyone thinking that they came from Benetton. As refueling had been introduced in 1994, one of their questions was, can we remove the filter from the new refueling rigs? And the answer was yes. So what did Ligier do with this information? Well, of course, they told Benetton, and only Benetton. Using Ligier meant Benetton could gain information without Ferrari or Williams getting suspicious. It was absolutely genius. So quickly back to that fuel fire. Well, it turned out that some debris had got stuck between the fuel hose and the filler on the car, and that was what spilt the fuel, causing the fire. This was a design error and was fixed for 1995. However, the FIA had some other ideas on who they wanted to take the blame.
The FIA did not want to blame the refueling company, because then that would remove public confidence in the refueling, and you'd get all those questions that the teams had already asked about safety would come back. Will this happen again? Yeah. So they really wanted to blame the team. And the night before the hearing, two people, so you can imagine who the Bennetton team representative was, had to be Flavio, and the person from the FIA, there's only one person it could have been, that was Max. And so they had a conversation. The technical team came back from Paris pretty pissed with Flavio because he'd done a deal with the FIA to say, hands up, we did remove the filter, hands up, we did not have permission, hands up, that was the cause of the fire, which it wasn't. And so I was really pissed with Flavio about information flow and then about doing a deal with the FIA instead of having the bravery. But what did Flavio do? He ensured we were still in the championship because he was told, I'm sure, we would be excluded from the championship. We knew that we were in a very strong position, or Flavio knew he was in a strong position. If he was excluded from the championship, his chance of doing his job for the Bennetton family were pretty much gone. My feeling is there was an advantage.
But first, a word from our sponsors, CyberGhost. CyberGhost is a world leader in the security and privacy industry and has the most recommended VPN on Trustpilot with over 38 million users, thanks to its user-friendly approach and platform design. This VPN hides your IP address, encrypts your data, and redirects all your internet traffic through a secure VPN tunnel, so you can surf the web securely with freedom. Their no logs policy is so airtight. They don't even know when you are online. The software also unblocks over 35 major streaming platforms, including Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and BBC iPlayer, so you can enjoy your favourite shows from wherever you are on Earth. You can access these platforms through the app, which can be found on all major operating systems, and one subscription can be used on up to 7 devices at one time, so it can be shared with your family and friends. CyberGhost VPN has servers in over 90 countries, so you can always trust a consistent, secure VPN connection from anywhere. If you want to enjoy all the benefits of CyberGhost VPN, now's the perfect time. By using the link in the description, you can get an 84% discount. That's just $2.03 a month. And you also get 4 months for free. And since they have a 45-day money-back guarantee and access to 24/7 customer support in 4 languages, everything is risk-free for you. So use the link in the description and sign up to CyberGhost VPN today. So let's check in on Flavio so far. He's built a good team with some clever ideas, but has been involved in fraud, a massive fire, and some, let's say, cheeky interpretations of the rules. But it gets much worse. In 1994, Schumacher was banned for 2 races for ignoring black flags at the British Grand Prix, after he overtook rival Damon Hill on the formation lap. He was also disqualified from the Belgian Grand Prix for having 1.7mm of extra wear on the plank in post-race scrutineering. And 1.7mm in this case is a lot. But there is one accusation of cheating that stands above the rest: traction control gate. Electronic driver aids were banned in 1994, but once again other teams were suspicious of the Benetton car, especially Schumacher's car, which was acting as if it had traction control. This was highlighted at the start of the French Grand Prix when Schumacher's Benetton shot between the 2 Williams on the front row and led into the first corner. I mean, you could hear the ECU cutting the engine. I distinctly remember that from watching F1 at the time. Benetton didn't help themselves either, acting suspiciously when called to action. After the tragedies of Imola 94, losing Senna and Ratzenberger, the FIA asked the top 3 teams from the weekend, Benetton, Ferrari and McLaren, to provide copies of their code from their engine management systems. Ferrari submitted it immediately, but McLaren and Benetton didn't for some time, raising suspicions further, and the teams would eventually receive a fine for their troubles. In July, the FIA announced that they found a launch control system when analysing Benetton's engine software, which was hidden under a secret menu. But the team claimed the system was redundant and couldn't be activated by the drivers, if you believe that at all. But what really was going on with the Benetton?
A headline says traction control is banned, but the regulations, technical regulations, are written in a very specific way. You're not allowed to have software that measures what gear you're in, but there were loopholes open that allowed us to have effectively traction control so long as the atmospheric conditions didn't change much during, let's say, a test session or a race. The mechanism was a bit like this. You were allowed to limit the rate of acceleration of an engine. The reason for this is Formula One engines back then were extremely light and had very light rotating components. So if a driver just went full throttle, bang, poof, full throttle, with the engine in neutral, the engine would accelerate so fast the rev limiter would not be able to protect it. In other words, one engine firing would take it from the risk zone to way past exploding. And you were allowed an atmospheric pressure measurement because you go at sea level, you have 1,023 millibars, and you go to Mexico City and you have maybe 700 millibars. And you have to change the fueling to allow for that. But if you're thinking, then as speed increases, the pressure in your airbox increases. So if you look at what is my RPM and what is the pressure in my airbox, if you're going in first gear, the pressure in your airbox is atmospheric. So if you've got 1,020 millibars and you are at 8,000 RPM or 12,000 RPM, you're probably in first gear. If you've got 1,021.5 millibars, you're probably in a different gear. Now you know what gear you're in and what revs you're doing, and you limit the rate of acceleration of the engine to protect it. So we had traction control on the Bennetton in '94, but it was perfectly legal. It was within the letter of the law. And when Ayrton Senna says, these guys have got traction control, we all knew we had traction control. We're not going to say anything. We're not going to explain how we've done it. Then everyone else is going to do it. And that's the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the regulation. And in Formula One, there's almost no spirit.
Despite all of this controversy, it still wasn't enough to deter Ferrari from approaching Briatore after the '94 season, in an effort for him to join them, but he decided to stay at Benetton as he was already heavily invested in the team. Michael Schumacher went on to win the '95 championship in much less controversial circumstances. He won it with 2 races to go in the season, while the team took home the Constructors' Championship for the very first time. However, this would be the end of success for the Benetton team. Schumacher, Brawn and others jumped ship to Ferrari in 1996, and at the time everyone thought it was to distance themselves from the many allegations of cheating that had plagued the Benetton team during the previous 2 seasons. With these valuable people leaving the team, Benetton quickly dropped back to the midfield by the end of the '97 season, and Briatore was fired from the team he had been so instrumental in making winners. However, his association with F1 wasn't over. Far from it. As you may have guessed by now, Briatore was always one to sniff out an opportunity to make money. When fired from Benetton, he set up a company and used his stock of Renault engines from his Ligier purchase and sold them back to his former team, plus Williams, BAR and Arrows, under the brand Supertech and Playlife in 1999 and 2000. A clever way to make some money. In 2000, Renault announced their return to F1, buying into the Benetton team, and after 3 years of being fired, Briatore was back as managing director and team principal.
We need to be part of this business because it's our business.
Renault would take full control of the team in 2002, and it would once again hit the front of F1 with Briatore having a big hand in it. During Briatore's sabbatical, he met a young Spaniard called Fernando Alonso, and in 1999 swiftly took him under his wing. He placed him in the Minardi team in 2001, and after a year as a test driver in 2002, Alonso was promoted to a race seat in 2003, replacing Jenson Button. With Briatore and Alonso leading the way, the team went a step further than Benetton and won both championships in 2005 and 2006, making Alonso the youngest double world champion in F1 history, and without controversy. But history would repeat itself for Briatore. His lead driver would leave for a new team and Renault would fall back into the midfield in 2007. However, this time his star driver came back to the team in 2008, after a tricky year at McLaren partnered with a young Lewis Hamilton. With his prodigal son back, Briatore would do anything to get him on the top step of that podium, but this time he went too far. In the first half of 2008, Renault was stuck in midfield battles and fighting over the last places in the points. Alonso was driving as well as ever, helping the team outperform the car. However, the team's big update worked for the second half of the season, and during the inaugural Singapore Grand Prix weekend, Alonso looked like a contender. Unfortunately for him, him a fuel feed issue in qualifying meant he only started 15th on the grid and was out of contention. However, fortune would turn around in the race as a crash by his teammate Nelson Piquet Jr. brought out the safety car and propelled Alonso to the front as he had pitted for fuel only 2 laps earlier. Alonso made up time over everyone else as they pitted under the safety car. In those days, the pit lane didn't immediately open under a safety car, so the field bunched up before the majority of cars pitted for fuel and tyres. Alonso would go on to take the checkered flag and win the first ever F1 night race. It all seemed too good to be true, and that's because it was. Not long after, Briatore fired Nelson Piquet Jr. after the 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix, and in the process set off a ticking time bomb. Once fired, Piquet went on the offensive, slandering Briatore to any publication that would listen and calling him his executioner. Around the same time, rumours started by a Brazilian TV network were circulating that Briatore, Pat Simmons and Nelson Piquet had plotted a scheme to help Alonso win the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix by deliberately causing a crash to bring out the safety car. And before long, the FIA announced they had invited Renault representatives to the World Motorsport Council in Paris to answer the charges of breaching Article 151C of the International Sporting Code, which basically stated that they thought Renault were cheating. But before the hearing could take place, both Briatore and Simmons left their posts at Renault when the team decided not to contest the charges the FIA had brought against them. And for the other teams in the pit lane, Renault deciding not to contest was all they needed to hear, with Eddie Jordan saying, suggesting they are not going to contest the allegations is in itself an admission. I don't know what goes on in teams. In the Jordan team, you would contemplate all sorts of things, but you certainly wouldn't contemplate that. I mean, Piquet literally practiced the spin on the warm-up lap, stopping just before the barrier at the exact same corner. Briatore had pushed too far. He had crossed a line, and this time he would be punished. The World Motorsport Council meeting still went ahead without Briatore and banned him for life from any FIA-affiliated motorsport event in any capacity whatsoever. Now, he wasn't even allowed to buy a ticket and watch a race. And of course, Briatore fought back, saying Max Mosley had banned him because of a previous political row, not because of the cheating. And the FIA really didn't like that. Briatore accused Mosley of being blinded by an excessive desire for personal revenge, as Mosley assumed the roles of complainant, investigator, prosecutor and judge in the case. The French court actually ruled his ban was illegal and overturned it in 2010, but the FIA would refuse to budge on their ruling, maintaining his total ban from motorsport. Briatore was banned from all motorsport for life. That was that. He flirted with the rules of motorsport for years, and the rules finally caught up with him. Well, he was banned for life, but just as we've seen before, nothing can keep him away from a good opportunity. The management of F1 has changed hands since the FIA ruling, and in true F1 fashion, the new commercial holders, Liberty Media, have invited Flavio back, but not to compete this time. It helps that he's good friends with the new F1 CEO, Stefano Domenicali, and Domenicali has asked Briatore to do what he does best: bring even more money in for the sport. And we know, of course, that Flavio likes to make money. You should check out this video on when F1 teams cheat. Make sure you drop a like and a sub if you enjoyed this new series. We're excited to make more of this type of video. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.